Welcome back to the Research Rundown presented by the PBATS Inside Athletic Training Podcast. Today we're joined by Paul Buchheit of the Philadelphia Phillies and Nick Jensen of the Milwaukee Brewers to take a closer look at how pitch tracking data is being used to identify early warning signs associated with acute UCL injuries in Major League pitchers. Enjoy the show.
All right, welcome to the PBATS Inside Athletic Training Podcast. I'm Paul Buchheit, Director of Medical Services and Head Athletic Trainer with the Philadelphia Phillies. And today, happy to be joined by Nick Jensen, Major League Assistant Athletic Trainer with the Milwaukee Brewers. So, Nick, thanks for joining this today.
Yeah, you got it. Anything to help.
Now, full disclosure, Nick, you and I don't know each other all that well. I mean, I think we've had maybe a couple conversations, but we had a good combo at winter meetings talking about, the research aspect of PBATS, specifically the research page on the PBATS website that is kind of like this curated list of articles that clinicians can go to just to speed themselves up on a specific topic. I quickly got the sense you're passionate about, reading the evidence and getting the message out there. That's really how this started. And I'm really interested in gaining your insight from talking to somebody a little different today. So now the article you brought up was interesting. So the title of the article is Using Pitch Tracking Metrics to Identify Warning Signs Immediately Prior to Acute Ulnar Collateral Ligament Injuries in Major League Baseball Players. Yes. How did you come by this article?
Truthfully, there's a lot of articles I had in mind that I wanted to bring up on this podcast, and I was trying to think which route do I want to go. And then at the end of it, I was like, let me choose something that I haven't read yet. And so I just started perusing. I think I just typed in pitch metrics in PubMed and Google Scholar and kind of did a little bit of a search. And I wanted to do something recent from this past year or even this year if able. But I just saw that topic, and I like looking at pitch metric data. I like looking at pitch metric data and trying to line it up and to tell a story when it comes to the strength conditioning side of things, talking with our group, as well as any of just the range of motion or strength testing that we do from a medical side. And so I try to always pair that stuff up to create a picture of more of a chronic cases. And so when I saw this and it said acute, it definitely got me interested because we're always trying to, prolong availability of a player and mitigate his risk as much as possible. And so if we can do that faster, based off some of these pitch metrics and things to look out for, then it at least starts a conversation a little bit more. So it definitely got my interest. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it now.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the article, what was preconceived notions when you read the title of the article? What preconceived notions have you had or pearls of wisdom that you've gained from people you've worked with on what things to look out for in game? When a pitcher's on the mound, what are the things you're kind of dialed into of like, this is maybe not going in a good direction?
Yeah. So besides kind of the research of it's great to look at things post hoc and kind of get an idea of that lead leg was a little bit more went into flexion than how he started. But I think listening to our pitching coaches, I tell you, man, you do one thing different and that pitching coach is on it. They know exactly how these guys are supposed to move. For me, it's starting to be little subtle things, right? Like, how's the guy finish a pitch? Does he do anything with his hand? Does he kind of shake his arm out? Does he move his elbow around? I also look for kind of stride length. Is he getting out to the position that he tends to? And for me, with my untrained eye compared to someone who's been doing it for 20, 30 years, right? I just try to pick a body part and just kind of focus on that because it's a little easier for me than kind of looking at the whole. But I'll focus on, like I said, a little bit of a lead leg position. Sometimes elbow, is it dropping a little bit more than he has been? And then that'll kind of coincide with what this article talks about and what the research says about, just release side and kind of arm angle dropping over time. So there's just a couple things I look for, but what else? I'd probably, command, right? Guy starts, a guy who throws strikes, all of a sudden can't find the plate. You start looking at that. Velo, obviously. So I guess those are all things are kind of going through my mind that I watch in a game. But the biggest thing is kind of just listening to what the pitching coaches are saying. Sometimes they'll just shout out something, and you kind of got to like perk your ears up and watch. And sometimes it's nothing, but they're a wealth of knowledge.
Absolutely. I think you brought up a good point. I mean, worked with some really, really great pitching coaches, and their keen eye and just the feel for the player too, the mannerisms, how they're moving. Like that's usually where I go, right? It's like I'm relying on them because they have the expertise and that knowledge base of all these pitchers they've gone through and seen, and they pick up on things so subtle that could be impactful. And so it's always cool just sitting there watching a bullpen with pitching coach and be like, "Hey, what'd you see there?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I didn't even pick up on that." So that's pretty cool. So with this article, what did the authors like? Why did they do this article? Why did they do this research? Talk a little bit about their hypothesis and kind of how they put it all together.
Yeah, I think the biggest reason for doing it was the fact that there's nothing showing an acute UCL injury. Most of the research is over time, after fatigue measures, right? Like that's kind of in lab as well. And there's pieces. So there wasn't really anything using pitch metrics to show an acute UCL injury. So I believe they said at the end that this is kind of the first study, at least to their knowledge, that did that. So that was definitely, I would say, novel on their end. But I have it here, like they hypothesized that the injury pitch itself would represent a clear mechanical outlier relative to each pitcher's recent baseline. And second, that they hypothesized that the cumulative mechanical deviation of the 5 fastballs before the injury would be significantly greater than the pitcher's typical variability. So, like, to me, these two things are basically, right, like it's variability and mechanics, variability and fastball, like location and just mechanics overall. Which they were right on those.
Yeah, that's right. I thought it was fascinating that the authors noted that this hadn't been studied specifically for UCL. I think they referenced quite a few research studies that were done on a cumulative effect over time, what the trends were, maybe per general injury, but not UCL specifically. And that is kind of the biggest issue we have in baseball, right? It's the most time lost of any injury that we're experiencing for the most part. And as we know, it's becoming ever more prevalent in our major league, minor league players, but also, in amateur baseball too. So it's like, okay, so we have a problem, but they haven't identified maybe what the precursors are that in the game. So that's really interesting that now with the wealth of knowledge that we have and all the biomech and data analysis, that this is kind of the first one to get done. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is quite surprising. And I'm sure there are some stuff is lacking probably in research. Like I'm sure some teams probably have their own, special sauce or blend that they look for. But it's nice to see it out in the public eye, right? Like you said, it's which injury for the most part causes the most time lost, the most money, dollars accrued for rehabs. So it makes sense to want to study, like, how do we prevent this, acutely?
Yeah, that's a good point too. Is like Major League Baseball organizations, we have the biomech in-house, we have the pitching coaches, we have the clinicians, and we're all working in unison to try and mitigate some of these things. And we may necessarily not, divulge our secrets, so to speak, but so we're maybe doing this in real time. But it's good to get this information out there because, for amateur baseball clinicians that are, what can they do to help mitigate injuries for their players? This information could be really helpful. Now, like they didn't have a ton of a huge sample size, right? Like I think they only had 7 pitchers that had like an index injury on one single pitch. And I guess that kind of doesn't seem like a lot. But when they put it all together, it was like they excluded all the pitchers that had any like precursor symptoms, or that might have been taken out in between innings. So that kind of whittles it down pretty good. And so even though the sample was small, it seemed like they had a pretty good methodology to control for that with analyzing pitchers that were very similar to them that didn't have injuries.
Yeah, totally agree. I like, in the past, I was always told, and this, I guess, was kind of funny, where it's like you look at it and go 7, that's not really a high number. I'm looking for, as many reps and numbers as possible. But, like you said, they had 160 plus, I forget, I think it's 167, 164. But because of the strict like exclusion data, it only wound up being 7 total athletes, like you said, with matched controls that met the criteria of, an acute injury being removed post injury throw, as well as the data for the 4 games prior to that exact throw. So I think this is a case where a lower number is actually stronger. I think gives the article a little bit more strength just in general because of like that strict inclusion and exclusion data. So I am glad to see like we got at least 7 out of there that met all this criteria. But I think the data would have been probably a little different if we'd included everybody who had, like you said, like vague symptoms removed in between games, maybe didn't have the StatCast data to match it. Because there's sometimes we go to specific stadiums and we won't get or have the StatCast data. So it's really nice when you kind of paint a full picture, and it's just good for everybody. I think it's just good for all teams, kind of like you said, help mitigate some risk.
Yeah, they talked about that in the article too. That this StatCast was really kind of an adoption over the last several years. And so they included, I think, from like 2020 to 25 or 24, sorry. So yeah, previous studies, I don't think had the ability to dive into their level. Now, can you talk a little bit about what they were actually measuring and what they were looking for in terms of their mechanics and the deviations of those mechanics compared to their baseline?
Yeah. So essentially, like you said, they tracked players from 2020 through 2025 and just kind of retrospectively looking at, they looked at mechanics, they looked at velocity, they looked at spin rate, they looked at release extension, arm angle, and acceleration magnitude. So there's a bunch of different pieces of data that were measured on StatCast and that, at every stadium, every system. And so based off of those, they would look at the previous 5 fastballs as well. So like, I think there was one person in the 7-person group that actually didn't meet a criteria. It probably would have been 100% for one of the other results, but the fact that they didn't get to 5 fastballs in the outing, so that's to me, it's also like a sign as well. Like that player probably should have been included. Just so happens, again, this is the strict inclusion that lowered that percentage. But looking at all of those measures over time, as well as the previous 4 outings and the 5 fastballs leading up to the injury, pretty clear idea of who this pitcher is. And that it's not just, hey, this is one game. It's the variability of that game could just be that guy that day. But when you string it out over 4 games, that could be X amount of days at that point, with off days in between, with treatments, with all this other stuff, right? So you hope it's not just a one-off, and now you kind of have a little bit of a story or like a routine for this player.
Yeah, I thought that was great that they looked at not only the index outing, the outing in which they were looking at, but also the previous outings as well to build a profile of what that movement quality of that pitcher was, and then look at the pitch in which they got injured and see, okay, is there any difference in what they, those things you talked about, whether it was velocity, arm slot, spin rate, and all that stuff, to see if there was a difference. So it seems like they did a really good job with that inclusion exclusion criteria, and then creating a sample to create a profile. Now, what did they end up finding out of those 7 pitchers who ended up getting hurt on one pitch?
But they essentially found 3 things that were significant. The first essentially is that 7 out of 7, so 100% of the pitchers that were injured on a pitch, it was a mechanical outlier or a deviation of their normal that essentially reached a threshold, 95% percentile variability threshold. So that was significant. It showed, secondly, that the pitchers, the 5 fastballs leading up to it were, I guess, all variable. Like there wasn't any consistency or like, a rise up or a smooth rise down. It was just essentially, and I would even almost include all 7 pitchers. It says 6 of 7 included here. But like I said, the one outlier here didn't meet the fastball criteria just for sheer number. But again, like that is all variability. So something's going on from, systemically there. And then the last thing they found was that velocity and arm angle both dropped. So suppression, velocity, and then an acute arm angle drop.
And then I found it interesting so all those 7 guys showed variability leading up to the pitch that got injured. And all of the pitches that they threw when they got hurt were obviously suppressed in velo and arm slot had lowered for the most part. Obviously when you have an injury during the moment, the body's going to react to it. And so that's probably what happened. But the pitches leading up to it showed a trend as well. Whereas the match controls didn't show any really variability like they did with the injured group. Is that right?
Correct. I think only one person the 14 match controls they had showed something. But for the most part, right, like each match control, and I think it was matched for like handedness, velo, weight, maybe like pitch count at the time of season. So they tried to do the best job they could for matching, workload to the pitcher. But yeah, and I want to say even two of the injuries were caused on changeups, right? Like even that's probably a good topic to talk about, right? Like everyone thinks it's going to be, a slider or a fastball or something different, but then you got one of your slowest pitches causing injury.
Yeah, so you brought up the timing of the season. This was like a little nugget that I was like, just reading through the article, and I saw that in the previous season, the injured pitchers threw like 1,100 pitches for the season, and at the point in when they got hurt, I think it was like in the high 300s. So that kind of indicates maybe it was at the earlier part of the season because they hadn't accrued that full season workload. In my mind, I start thinking about things like the Chalmers study in 21, I think it was, where they looked at how the UCL thins and shortens in the off season and then lengthens and thickens in season, and how they saw that was kind of workload dependent. So it's almost like the UCL kind of has to stretch out a little bit as they get going for the season to accommodate the amount of torque going through the elbow. But we know that most of the UCL injuries occur earlier in the season, maybe when the UCL hasn't gotten to its normalized length and thickness, right? So I just found that interesting that this, if that's the case, that's kind of what that tells me. It's earlier in the season. These guys are, still getting built up for the season, and this is when it occurred. So,
That's a good point.
So with the findings, what did they, the authors ultimately conclude? Like, what was their like take home for their findings for people to utilize? Now, I will also say they also said it wasn't predictive because of the smaller sample size, but it was descriptive. I mean, it's pretty
for sure.
It's pretty sure that when there's smoke, there's fire. When you start having variability in your mechanics, your arm slot starts lowering, your velo starts dropping, there's fire. So what did they ultimately come to the conclusion of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote they use. I know you and I kind of talked about this previously, but they talked about how short-term mechanical volatility, when superimposed on chronic stressors, may precipitate ligament overload. Essentially, the fancy way of saying like acute on chronic, right? Like whether or not it's a high workload, like we don't have to talk about all the chronic stressors that potentially could be going on, but essentially, it doesn't take much at that point where an injury may occur. And I think that the biggest takeaway of this article, right, is like there are some findings that we can look at now that potentially can lead to, an acute UCL risk. And kind of like you said, like it's descriptive, not predictive in a sense, but like we're probably not going to pull a guy just because we see an arm angle drop mid inning. But at the same time, I guess to use it from my lens, at least, I'm going to be looking at this player's previous history, their workload, their current health metrics and data. And right, like kind of like I said in the beginning, like you want to tell a story of each pitcher, so that I'm hopefully staving off those pieces when they are in game, right? Like that's where I think the athletic trainers are extremely valuable, because we can help mitigate some of this, whether you call it fatigue, just combat the chronic stressing of the tissue, the system, any of the above. Like we have a plenty of ways to kind of attack that. And so the better we can prepare the athlete for each outing, whether a starter or reliever, we'll be able to hopefully mitigate some of this variability that they've noticed on that game day. Like, granted, there'll probably still be some some injuries that are the outliers, and obviously that's just part of the game. But like ethically, I'm trying to do everything I possibly can so I keep our players on field and available. But I am now going to have a conversation with our pitching staff a little bit closer. If I see something, I might inch down the dugout a little bit more and get closer to the coaching staff, and kind of play put an eye at least towards the arm angle, the drop, kind of see if I can tell anything mechanically going on with the guy, or at least have that conversation with the pitching coach. But yeah, I mean, just like I tell you, right, it's gonna say more research needs to be done on this topic to identify the chronic stress and everything else that might lead to it. But at least right now, it shows that there are some measures that we're tracking that we can use towards injury monitoring, and at least put that in our toolbox to put towards this player's story with all their other data.
Yeah, that sentence you quoted from their discussion might be one of my favorite all time. So it just sums up a lot of the things that I think about in a way better way and much more succinctly.
Yeah.
You talked about it when we first got on the podcast. Was you're looking at the range of motion, you're looking at their strength numbers, all the metrics that we may take from a strength conditioning perspective. What's their force production? What's their force acceptance like? And you overlay that with their previous injury history profile, maybe some baseline imaging. Maybe they already have some of those chronic adaptive changes and tissue insufficiencies. And we as clinicians, I think we do a really good job of just intuitively thinking about all that in real time. And so that way, when we see something like this, and we're like, oh, in-game variability of arm angle and velo, that matters. Now we may start thinking a little bit more about all those other things that we have in the back of our head, that they may be impactful, because you superimpose that volatility, it may lead to a break. Now the tough question is, and I have to ask you this one, is what do you see as the barriers? Like, how do we as clinicians take this information on pitching and try to have those conversations with the manager and the pitching coach?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to use some personal experience here, right? Because like you can say, hey, this guy's red, needs to be out, and then let's say he has the game of his life, and then now you lost credibility from the coaching staff or vice versa. And I think the best thing to do is, like we've done before, if there's a player and it lines up in their schedule, and the history and their current state is kind of telling us, hey, this guy might need a day. Or we had a travel day, West Coast to East Coast. He didn't, doesn't feel his best, whatever it might be. Can we line him up on a better day, fitting in the schedule? And I think that's kind of our pitching group has been great with that, where sometimes they do it before they even talk to us. Hey, I'm going to give this guy an extra day. We're going to line him up on this day. We'll bring somebody up to cover. They do like a little shuffling around the rotation. You can do that at specific times of the year, and especially knowing your guy and knowing, hey, this guy's not going to have a ton of workload to begin with for the whole year, so we can kind of be smart and move him around. So I think that's kind of the piece. Like we can give the coaching staff some of this data and let them know, like, hey, we're looking at these things. We're seeing a downward trend based off these pitches. Like they'll probably even bring it up to us first, like, hey, so-and-so's fastball doesn't have life anymore. And then we'll look at their data and say, yeah, that looks like showing some signs of, maybe some fatigue. These things we can do. They'll say, hey, can we give him another, is giving him an extra day beneficial? And like, heck yeah. So that's on us to kind of promote some recovery in the training room, in the strength room. We kind of hit it from all angles. We performance nutrition, like you name it, we're going to hit it from every angle. But I think that's probably where we get our best buy-in. And that's going to be that conversation where it's just all of us working together to kind of give this player, when we can, the best chance of being successful. I think it's going to be tough to kind of pull somebody in game, mid game, depending on how we're doing. I mean, I've kind of said this before, but it's like you try and stay away from somebody, then all of a sudden the situation demands it in the 7th or 8th inning, and you can't get out of it. So
it always does, right? It always happens that way.
Always does. So it's better to get.
But we're going to stay away from this guy, and it's like, but we could really use him here, right?
And then
I think that's where you got to pick your battles too, and just know, like you said, know your players.
Sure.
The work,
especially right. I
Go
was
ahead.
going to say, and the bigger thing too, now that I'm thinking about it, these guys don't have any symptoms. For the most part, they're not going to say anything, right? Like this was acute injuries that happened. So it's not like he's got like vague form soreness or something going on. It's like this guy is maybe doesn't even go into the training room. And how are we supposed to, it's hard to pull a guy mid game based off of data we're getting where it could just be. Like I've had a guy when we talked about like stride length changes. He's like, no, I meant to do that in game, and it's like the count dictated it, this dictated it. And I was like, okay, was not aware, and then kind of like cross that off with our our biomech side. But it's tough. It's tough to pull a guy when there's no symptoms unless it comes from our pitching staff for the most part.
Yeah. And well, in Major League Baseball too, we don't have the availability of looking at these metrics in real time either. So,
Correct. Yep.
so, we're going to be relying on our pitching coaches, managers, or even our eyes to interpret this information and be like, okay, I'm seeing something. And it brings to mind something our medical coordinator says a lot, Justin Aarons. He's like, don't only go to the pitching coach and manager when you have problems, right? Because then you're only going to be raising the red light every time you go up to him. It's like develop that relationship with him early, check in with him, give him good news at times. So that way, when you do go up there and say, hey, I'm not liking what's going on, it means something, and you're not just going there to say, to be the bearer of bad news all the time. But to your point, it's going to be tough to pull a guy who's pitching really well in the seventh inning and he has some variability in his mechanics that you're seeing, but he's doing well. But I think that's where you made a good point of just how you overlay that in-game, kinematics of what you're seeing on top of all the other information you have and weighing that to what's the player's goal right now? What is, what's their recent workload been? What does the team need at that time too? And maybe it's a situation where you do have a little bit of a rested bullpen, and you could say, yeah, maybe we pull back on this starting pitcher, because he is showing these things, and we just make sure he's good, and then we go back out there and good the next time. Those are the kind of situations where you could just, give the pitching coach a little nudge. Like, what do you think here? That's what comes to my mind, anyways.
Yeah, exactly. And even like, right, for instance, a reminder for me, like this is spring training is, granted it was our second, as a staff, second year with everybody. But overall, it's like building that, that trust now, and having those conversations, right? Like you never want to go to somebody when it's I need, or there's an issue, right? Like you want to build that, that trust and rapport early on, so that when you do have a conversation, it is a conversation that they hear you, versus up here comes the Grim Reaper or something, right? And you start getting that nickname.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we are coming up on the 30 minutes here. Any final thoughts, related to this article or in general that clinicians could, just take home from this conversation?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing, right, like is look a little deeper than surface. So you see somebody that come in with, let's say, elbow soreness, don't just I'm going to attack the elbow, right? Like we have to look a little deeper. We can look at their pitch metrics. We're allowed to look at the pitch metrics. We can have conversations with our strength staff, with our our pitching staff and our biomechanical group, right? Like we can use everybody around in order to make the best plan and hopefully the best plan of care for each athlete. So again, like this study was novel, where it was the first one assessing acute UCL injury in game using pitch data. So I would say just get comfortable, get familiar with the data. What does it mean? Have conversations with other people in your group if you're unaware of how to use this data or what it actually means, because this is going to be next, right? Like they're going to use this more and more. I mean, there's so many different abbreviations for stats now that I can't keep up. So being comfortable,
For sure.
so being comfortable with this type of data is super important, and it will help you stay ahead of, I want to say being complacent, but it'll help you stay ahead of, just staying and towing the line of being like a normal clinician. Like you got to dig a little deeper, you got to find these pieces, and you got to help the athlete as best as you possibly can by finding all the pieces that maybe went in, like being a little detective and finding the pieces that are going into into this issue.
I think that's the way to end it, man. You got to be a detective. That was a great way to describe it. Well, thank you, Nick, for bringing this topic up and sharing your insights. Thanks to Sam Radville for always putting on a good show with this podcast. And till next time, go P-Bats.
Yeah, go P-Bats. Thanks, Sam. Thanks again. And good talking, Paul.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Inside Athletic Training Podcast. For more information about PBATS and the profession of athletic training, visit pbats.com. See you next time.